Akira Kurosawa, born in 1910, died 1998, is one of the greatest directors in Japanese film history. His feature filmmaking career spanned a full half-century from 1943 to 1993. When Ran came out in 1985, there was a lot of speculation that it would be his last film. He turned 75 just before the premiere, and in fact, in many ways, it feels like a last film. I think he consciously intended it as to be the sort of culmination of his career. He did actually go on to make 3 more films, but they're all on a much smaller, sort of lower key scale. And prior to that, he was very prolific indeed from the 1940s to the mid-1960s. We're talking roughly 1 film a year, give or take. And then there was a dramatic slowing down in output. In fact, for the next 20 years, 1965 to 1985, he only made 4 films. Several reasons for this. First of all, there was a major financial crisis in the Japanese film industry, and one of the big problems for Kurosawa was that he tended to make precisely the kind of really large-scale, really big-budget films that were increasingly hard to fund. So he went to Hollywood, where he had 2 fairly disastrous attempts, in fact totally disastrous attempts at getting film projects off the ground. The first was Runaway Train, which was a sort of high-speed action thriller set on a runaway train, which was going to star Lee Marvin and Henry Fonda, and which was postponed indefinitely during pre-production. It was eventually made, but by a different AK, Andrei Konchalovsky, but in fact the year that Ran came out. More disastrously, he spent a great deal of time preparing for the film Tora Tora Tora, which is about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that was supposed to be a big sort of West-East co-production, with Kurosawa was handling the Japanese point of view, and another director who Kurosawa was under the impression would be David Lean would be handling the American perspective. And then the American one was actually directed by Richard Fleischer, who was a sort of perfectly competent director, but not in the David Lean class, and not in the Kurosawa class either. And Kurosawa was none too impressed by that. And despite doing a huge amount of preparatory work, he was not so much fired, but placed in an impossible position and couldn't continue with the production. So he went back to Japan. 1970, he made his first film in colour, Dodescaden, which was a commercial failure. And that was really the low point of his career. And in 1971, he attempted suicide, unsuccessfully, thankfully. But it was clear that he couldn't carry on working in Japan. So his next film was, in fact, a Soviet production, Dersu Uzala, which was his first film in a foreign language. And then after that put he certainly revitalised his reputation as a great filmmaker. But he still had real problems trying to raise funds for a Japanese film. He had 3 projects he was developing in the late 70s. One was Ran. One was an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, which was sadly never made. And the third was Kagemusha, which was another sort of historical epic set in a sort of similar time period to Ran. And that was Kagemusha was generally considered to be the more commercially appealing of the 3 projects. So that was the one that he ultimately ended up making. But he was only able to make it with the help of money from 20th Century Fox and the personal support of George Lucas and Francis Coppola, because Toho, the studio that had funded most of Kurosawa's films up to then, just said they simply were not able to finance a project on that kind of scale. 20th Century Fox were fairly reluctant as well, but George Lucas had just made a little film called Star Wars and was dangling the prospects of sequels in front of Fox and suggesting that maybe they might like to fund this little Japanese, well, actually rather large-scale Japanese film as a sort of thank you. And so that did in fact prevail. Kagemusha got made, big hit in Japan, contrary to lots of pessimistic Japanese expectations. It's competed at the Cannes Film Festival. It's shared the Palme d'Or with Bob Fosse's film All That Jazz. And it was generally got the highest profile release of anything that Kurosawa had made for many, many years. And it was the film that managed to get Ran finally off the ground. Critics often sort of jump to conclusions with the benefit of hindsight and say that such and such a film we can now see as clearly a dry run for something else. But in fact, Kurosawa himself admitted that Kagemusha was very much a dry run for Ran. He was testing out various things. For starters, he'd never made a historical epic, although he was probably certainly his most internationally renowned genre was the jidaigeki, or the sort of historical sort of period costume epic, sometimes known as the samurai film, although not necessarily featuring samurai. And And he'd never done one in colour, and he also hadn't done one for many, many years. So he had to sort of recharge his batteries and also find new ways of approaching it. And one of the things he started to do was he trained as a painter, and he started painting out the film in a series of very, very elaborate kind of storyboards come paintings to sort of give a strong hint of the approach he was going to make to colour, which was highly stylized, highly original, highly distinctive. And he was very happy with the results of that, and so he did the same approach for Rand. I mean, during the fundraising, he would sort of visualize the film to himself just by painting scenes from the film, and that's where things like the color coding of the armies came from. Kurosawa had previously, in 1957, made a film called Throne of Blood, which was a direct adaptation of Macbeth, and it's widely acclaimed as being one of the greatest Shakespeare films ever made, although paradoxically, because it's in Japanese, it doesn't actually use any of Shakespeare's original text. It's still one of Kurosawa's greatest films. It's an extraordinarily powerful, really, really concentrated work. Ran is slightly different. It is based on King Lear, but not a direct adaptation. In fact, he was already well into the first draft of the screenplay before he realised that there were strong similarities with King Lear coming out. It was originally based on the legend of a genuine 16th century Japanese warlord who named Mōri, who the legend has it, and this is dramatised in the film, he gave his three sons, his three famously loyal sons, 3 arrows individually, and then asked them to break them, which they did easily, and then gave them 3 arrows in a bundle and asked them to break them, and they couldn't. And that was the sort of symbol of the how strong and united the Mōri clan was, and the lesson was that together we are going to be stronger than anyone. And Kurosawa wondered what would happen if the sons weren't completely loyal. What would happen if one of them actually broke the bundle of arrows, which of course is possible, as is demonstrated in the film. And this would mean, would 16th century Japanese history, one of the sort of pivotal periods of Japanese history, have turned out rather different if one or more of the sons had been disloyal. And that's when the parallels with King Lear started to emerge. One thing he could have done, of course, would be to change the sons into daughters and make it much closer to the play, but that wasn't possible for various reasons, not least the historical fact that 16th century Japan was a far more patriarchal society, and it was just fairly inconceivable that a warlord, no matter how powerful, no matter how capricious, would divide up his kingdom to his daughters. So they remain sons. But there are still numerous parallels between Goneril and Regan and Cordelia. For example, the third son, the blue one, Subaru, is very much the Cordelia figure. He's the person who has much clearer-eyed vision of where things could go wrong, and warns Lord Hidetora, the King Lear figure, and of course is banished for his pains, which is obviously exactly the same thing that happens in King Lear. One very important difference. Shakespeare's Lear is, in fact, is self-described as a foolish, fond old man. We don't really know very much about his past. He seems quite benevolent. Maybe he is quite benevolent. We don't know. Kurosawa makes it absolutely clear right from the opening sequence that Lord Hidetora achieves his preeminence through absolute, total, bloodthirsty ruthlessness. Right at the start, we see that he is the one to successfully shoot the boar that they're hunting. There's then, during the discussion about the arrows, they sort of refer to how ruthless he's been in the past. Not long after that, he actually shoots a guard dead for harassing his jester, Kiyoami, who's the equivalent of the fool in Shakespeare's play. So he's a much nastier piece of work than Lear. Oh yeah, we also discover that he murdered. There's the two key female characters, Lady Sue and Lady Kaeda. In both cases, their families were completely massacred by Hidetora. They react to them in different ways. Sue turns to Buddhism and tries to achieve inner peace, while Lady Kaeda. Whereas Lady Kaeda absolutely spectacularly goes for all-out revenge. Now, Lady Kaeda, there's no... I suppose Goneril is the closest equivalent in King Lear, but of course she's also got a huge amount of Lady Macbeth in her. You can see her, in fact, the early scene in which Hidetora goes to see Terao, his oldest son, and Kaeda's husband, and you can actually see that she is very much planning a revenge along the lines of Lady Macbeth. She's doing it really coolly. Really, it's a very stylized performance. In fact, her performance, Miyako Harada, who played Lady Kaede, and Tatsuya Nakadai, who plays Hidetora, they're both very stylized, very much influenced by the Japanese No theatre, which was a very strong influence on Throne of Blood, and that's a strong link with that particular film. But then you get this extraordinary scene after Kaede's husband, Terao, has been killed in battle. Her brother-in-law Jiro goes to see her to explain things, and she sort of bases himself at his feet like a sort of good submissive sort of Japanese lady. And then when they're alone together, she erupts in this absolute frenzy, sort of pulling a knife on him, sort of cutting his neck, and then making it absolutely clear in a way that Lady Macbeth never did, because the only violence she meted out was to people who were asleep. And then there's this extraordinary sort of seduction scene where, which culminates in a sort of full-on sort of kiss on the lips, and then she sort of starts licking the blood that's flowing from his neck, which is clearly very different from Lady Macbeth, who quite famously had a bit of an aversion to blood. So yeah, but the other thing that Kurosawa drew very much from the play was there's a reference in Shakespeare to nature's moulds being cracked, and Kurosawa is constantly cutting to the sky in particular, various cloud formations which are alternately sort of benign and sinister, and there's very much a sort of theme of Ram. The title means chaos, and Kurosawa's thesis is about what happens when a formerly incredibly powerful warlord, his kingdom starts being rent asunder by his successors, who are just basically doing exactly the same thing that he did, only to each other. And it ends in, the ending of King Lear is pretty bleak, but Kurosawa goes one step further. It ends with the sort of blind Surumaru, who is the equivalent of Gloucester in the play, only crucial difference being he was blinded by Hidetora himself, not by Hidetora or Lear's enemies. And he's sort of standing on the edge of a precipice with a Buddhist scroll and just lets it sort of lets it drop into the abyss. It's one of the most downbeat endings I can imagine, certainly in Kurosawa's films as well as anyone else's. Kurosawa told the critic Michael Wilmington that one of his inspirations for Ran was the constant threat of nuclear apocalypse, which is a recurring theme in Kurosawa's films. He tackles it directly in a film called I Live in Fear, which was a film about a man absolutely terrified of nuclear apocalypse, and that was made just 1955, just 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And then in Dreams, which was the film he made immediately after Ran, one of the episodes in Dreams also tackles the theme of sort of nuclear holocaust. And one of Kurosawa's chief assistants during this whole period from Kagemusha to the end of his career was a man called Ishiro Honda, who was, he goes right back to they've been old friends since the 1930s. They started off as assistant directors. And then Honda went on to make a powerfully anti-nuclear film called Godzilla. And in fact, he then directed a large number of the subsequent Godzilla films, and started working as Kurosawa's assistant because he thought it would elevate his career back onto a sort of more artistically respectable plane. So again, you have you've got two filmmakers who both have very strong concerns about sort of nuclear devastation. And although there's obviously no nuclear devastation in a film set in 16th century Japan, one of Kurosawa's key themes was the introduction of what by those standards were weapons of mass destruction, namely the musket, which was first brought to Japan in the 16th century by a load of Portuguese traders, and within 10 years hundreds of thousands of them had been copied, and so for the first time relatively unskilled soldiers were able to kill people from a great distance, because you had archers before, but that demands a high level of skill, high level of training, and so mass destruction had come to Japan for the first time, and I think that was very much consciously one of Kurosawa's themes. And also, talking of mass destruction, another key influence on the whole of Kurosawa's career and sort of general sensibility was the great 1923 earthquake that devastated Yokohama and Tokyo. Kurosawa was a 13-year-old schoolboy at the time, and his older brother took him to see the devastation in Tokyo firsthand, and he never forgot it. Not just the the first-hand impression of Japan sliding into chaos, because the devastation was just appalling, but also what happens as a byproduct of that chaos, because there was extreme Japanese nationalists used this as an excuse to attack Koreans, usually through sort of trumped-up accusations that they were poisoning the wells. I mean, why would they poison the wells? There's no rationale for it at all. And in his autobiography, Kurosawa said that one well, they said, was poisoned because there was a Korean text next to it saying this well has been poisoned. Actually, it was a random scribble that Kurosawa had made himself, so he knew that the Koreans were completely innocent in that. So again, that whole notion of things just falling apart and just descending into chaos. 1923 to 1985, 62 years later, it's still there. Another challenge that Kurosawa had was to do with the locations. Japan had, this was the first film that he made that was shot substantially on location for many, many years in Japan. And one of the problems is that Japan had urbanized so much by the early 1980s that it was very, very difficult to find the kind of sort of great sweeping plains that he wanted. Sidney Lumet, the director who championed a great big push for the Oscars for Ran, asked Kurosawa why he'd framed a particular shot a particular way. And Kurosawa said, well, if I'd moved the camera a little bit to the left, you'd have seen the Sony factory. And if it had been moved a little bit to the right, you'd have seen the airport. And so he was sort of quite hamstrung by that to a certain extent. A lot of the film was shot in the slopes of sort of Mount Aso and Mount Fuji, of course, a extinct volcano famous for its very black ash. It's a very distinctive location. In fact, ideal as a kind of sort of equivalent of the kind of sort of blasted heath of Shakespeare's King Lear.